We're just gonna go ahead and be real cliche here by saying, hey, all you cool cats and kittens. Welcome to this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast, home of the mysterious and the macabre, where we sit in the studio every week challenging conventional thought. Sorry to disappoint you, but we are your hosts, Samantha Carter
and Sarah Jones.
We're really happy to be here with you this week, bringing you yet another weird and creepy edition of our show, and we really appreciate that you're here too, listening to us. If you're new here, please don't forget to go push the subscribe button on whichever podcast platform you're listening from, and if you get a few extra minutes and are feeling extra generous, leave us a rating and a review, because this is really important to our little show here, and it really helps us out a lot.
Not only that, but we're finding that word of mouth has been one of the best ways that people are finding out about us. So if you can think of anyone who might like Bigfoot for Breakfast, please let them know. And if you have an episode suggestion, any advice for us, or if you just want to pop in and say hey, you can also leave us a voicemail at 641-812-2635. You can also email us at bigfootforbreakfast@outlook.com or leave us a message on Facebook and we'll get back to you. We usually try to do a quick shout out for people as well because we really appreciate the communication so much.
So, in the spirit of the episode topic today, what kind of interesting quarantine activities are people up to? I have watched a significant number of quarantine haircuts, and I freaking love it, and even one day considered cutting my bangs, but then I was like, nah.
I have not seen that. Is that a thing?
Yeah, it's a thing.
Oh, I'm going to have to look this up.
Oh my gosh.
That's funny. I bet they're great.
No, they are not.
Probably looks like the quarantine haircuts around here. Non-existent. I did trim Piper's hair myself.
You did?
Yeah, I was super proud of it. It looks fine. I box dyed my hair at the beginning of this sucker, and then my roots are already growing out, so now I have to box dye it once again. I'm sure my hair girl, shout out Missy, is going to be real proud of that.
I haven't done anything with my hair, and I look terrible.
No, you don't. You look fine.
I look pretty rough.
You look all quarantine-y, like
right?
A pioneer.
Like a pioneer who ran out of freaking bleach.
Yeah, bleach. That's funny. It does feel like kind of a scary time because you go back and forth so much, well, I do, about, wanting to be compliant with the things that we're supposed to do because, me and Sam are both in nursing, so it's hard not to see that point of view. But then at the same time, it just feels so scary in a way that you're kind of walking a fine line with your rights when you start letting people tell you you can and cannot do things or you can and cannot go places. And, Iowa has been pretty lax really on their regulations. We don't have a shut-in order, but, we still have very few cases in the state and we're doing pretty well with that. But other places are a lot more strict on who can go here and there and what you can and can't do. And it's just a really scary thing, I think, to start letting them tell us that.
Well, my thing is the actual activities that they're limiting people on. Like, everybody's got to go to Walmart or the big stores because those are the only ones that are still open right now. But you're not allowed to go to the lake and go kayaking by yourself. Things like that. It's questionable sometimes, and like shutting off the non-essential goods, and I know that that's an effort to quote-unquote limit loitering per se around the stores, but especially for people like us in rural areas, we plant gardens, and a lot of places are not allowing you to buy vegetable seeds. It's questionable.
Are you sure?
Absolutely. Not around here because we're so
agriculture-y.
Well, we're in the middle of effing nowhere, but a lot of places, those sections are roped off.
I didn't know that. I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to get garden plants for later, so I started growing all mine from seed a couple weeks ago, 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they're all doing really good.
Which means I get homemade salsa.
That's true, and spaghetti sauce and whatever else. But I was going to say, we're a big camping family, too. We're really into, going to the lake and stuff, and it really sucks. It doesn't make any sense, though, because you're right. We go in one camper as one family. We really don't interact that much with other people, and we're far away from all the other campers.
Yeah, you have your own lot.
Yeah, so we would be just as isolated there as we are here.
If not more.
So it really sucks in a way. The kids are kind of feeling it too, being stuck in the yard, limited only to the yard all the time, where, I can go to the store and work if I need to. I don't know. I'm kind of feeling for them. I don't even know if this is true, but I read on the news or a news site a fake news site, I don't know, the other day about 2 parents who got arrested because they were playing t-ball in the park with their kid and they didn't want to leave.
Can't be at the park.
It's just crazy, though. I mean, just those 3 people playing some t-ball and nobody around them. And then another guy who was arrested at the beach for surfing out in the ocean by himself.
By himself.
Yeah, he's not near anyone. It's just kind of, I don't know. It's so questionable. You know, we care a lot about people's health and safety, and we get that. But the people who are appearing to be reasonable, I think that they should be left alone.
What's really frustrating is that people are getting arrested or fined, or the police are so tied up with things like that, but also there's so many of those large departments that are limiting, well, we're not going to respond to your domestic assault unless there's actually a bodily injury, or, you know, they're limiting what calls they're going to respond to, but then they're chasing down people that are
not necessarily following the rules, but still not exposing
not
others.
hurting anybody.
Yeah, I feel like it's important to use reasonable logic during times like this. And the libertarian in me wants to keep the government out of all of our business as much as possible. But, you know, the nurse in me still wants to protect the public. So it's so conflicting.
Well, yeah, and I agree with that as far as healthcare goes. As a provider, obviously, I care about protecting people. However, at what cost? The patriot in me
Right.
says, nah, bruh. Protect the people, you know, shut down the nursing homes from visitors and things like that. You have the right to stay home if you don't want to be exposed. You also have the right not to. I feel that very strongly. And granted, I know that there are exceptions to the rules, that people are going to be out being stupid and, you know, they don't care. But
I did see that at some nursing home, I don't remember where it was, a family, I think, went and put painter's tape on these big windows in the form of tic-tac-toe.
Yeah.
And they were playing tic-tac-toe with dry erase markers with the people on the other side.
Anyway, we should probably get back on subject.
Yes. So, without further ado, and since everyone these days seems to be on the subject of deadly disease, we are going to go right along with it. Like a bunch of sheep. Bah! But we're going to go back to one of the first major tragedies to ever be called a pandemic, the Black Death. We're going to be taking you on a walk down the creepier side of this subject, and as bad as the coronavirus seems to be, it seems like nothing compared to the horror that they were dealing with in the Middle Ages.
It all started much like other illnesses, with a tiny little microorganism. This particular bacteria is called Yersinia pestis. And it was spread by a pretty common pest that we still see today, fleas. Fun fact, you can still get Black Plague to this day.
Oh yeah, I talk about this later on. Yeah, it's a thing.
Well, I didn't know that was a thing until I thought prairie dogs were real cute. And they're like, wait, don't touch the prairie dogs.
I didn't know that about prairie dogs, but it seems like if it shows up in the United States, it is more toward like the Southwest area, kind of the Four Corners, Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, you know.
Prairie dog fleas.
Yeah, prairie dog fleas. Huh. Who would have thought? Man, they are cute though.
They are cute. I want to pet them.
That sucks.
The bacteria would basically cause the fleas to become septic and block their digestive systems. And while uninfected fleas would simply suck the blood of a person or an animal, these ones would suck their blood and then immediately vomit into the tiny open wound that it just caused with its bite.
Nom
noms.
Nom noms.
Thus infecting the individual. Fleas were far more widespread than they are today. There were no flea baths or pills that you could give your pets in order for you to keep them out of your house. So animals, houses, and people alike were commonly infested with them, with animals and rats running all over the place with unsanitary living conditions being pretty common. Fleas were freaking everywhere. Given this fact, it seems obvious how this illness spread like wildfire.
The way that the spread really got started, though, is a pretty interesting story. Before the spread of the plague throughout the world, certain parts of Asia had already been dealing with it for years. It had killed off a large percentage of the people in their isolated area, and most of the people who were left were said to have been unaffected because the community had built up such an immunity.
Herd immunity, there's a lot to be said for it.
Community immunity.
Guess what you have to have for community immunity?
What?
Exposure.
Well, yeah, that's what happened.
I'm being an asshole. Anyway, a much later study that I read concluded that they were fairly certain that it was Asia that provided the perfect climate for Yersinia pestis to thrive and continue to infect wildlife reservoirs there. It's a zoonotic disease, so it can be passed between animals and humans, and this transfer often happened due to fleas transferring from one host to another, and the bacteria evolves rapidly in response to changes in environment and hosts, which makes it all the more scary. Me and one of the doctors that I work with were talking about this the other night, actually. And he was talking about how they were all thinking that this was coming from the fleas. So they...
You mean the coronavirus?
No.
The plague.
The plague.
Okay.
And so since they were thinking it was from the fleas, so everybody goes and kills their cats and dogs to get rid of the fleas. And guess what kills rats? So most of the fleas were coming off the rats that were causing the plague.
Now that was probably more after the Black Death, because there were 3 plagues, the same plague that swept through Europe. So there was an earlier one. Then there was the Black Death that we'll be talking about in the mid-14th century. And then later there was another one. And I'm betting that they're talking about the later one, because during the Black Death, they didn't know. Actually, we talk about why they think it was spread. But I bet they did kind of figure it out and start killing off their pets, which is horrible.
Well, you kill the pets that kill the animals that carry the fleas that spread the plague.
The rodents. But then again, their pets were killing these rats and getting infected.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know. Whatever.
6 of one, half a dozen of the other.
Not much you can do.
It all leaves with dead cats.
Right?
Anyway.
Sam really loves cats. A lot. Asia has a dry and arid climate, which is really conducive to longer periods of survival and thriving of rats and gerbils. Apparently wild gerbils are a thing over there. I didn't know. Sounds really cute. We had gerbils, remember, when we were little kids, named Lucy and Ricky Ratcardo. Remember that?
Yes, I remember. And then they had baby Ricky.
Baby Ricky. And then one of them had gotten loose. I was holding one when I couldn't have been like 6, 7 years old. And I was holding it, and it went down into the couch, like it was starting to go down in the cushions, and I got scared, so I grabbed it by the tail. Did you know that they detach their tails? Can you imagine a 6-year-old
like lizards
pulling it back out, and I am holding only the tail of my pet gerbil? I was traumatized, but I didn't know that they just released them.
And then she ate it.
I didn't know. I did not. I cooked it first. Okay, so this was a thriving climate for rats and gerbils both, for fleas to feed on. And this climate was great for the fleas as well, because if you think about it, the fleas die off in the colder climates. So Asia has a long, dry summertime climate. So they lasted a lot longer, and it spread like crazy.
Now bear with us as we tell this story, because a lot of the reliable history sources that we found were slightly different in their telling. So we did our very best to get it all right. We are, in fact, not scientists.
Nor master historians.
Or epidemiologists.
We did our best to get this right, and we apologize for any, wrong facts. However, do point out if we did it. Just be nice to us, because we're sensitive.
I want to bake a cake out of smiles and rainbows, and we can all eat it together and be happy.
Right. So although Asia had already been affected for a while, the Mongols of the area also had control over Crimea, and there was a port there called Caffa. This port was established by Genoa, Italy, by an agreement with the Mongols, and this is where the Genoese connected and were able to trade goods with central Russia by traveling inland up the Don River. So basically, the Mongols had control of it, but the Genoese kind of made a deal with them, and they let them set up port there for trade. At the port, there was a Genoese outpost that housed the Italian men who guarded it. Caffa started out small, but it seems as though during that time period that we'll be talking about, the mid-1340s, the town had about 17,000 houses within its walls, so it had grown pretty significantly. The Mongols and the Italians at Caffa had never really had a solid relationship, and they were always weary of one another. The Mongol leader during this time had converted to Islam, and from what I can understand, due to this conversion, a violent religious battle had been waged against their Christian neighbors, who ended up barricading themselves inside their heavily fortified city. Apparently, in a neighboring town called Tana, some of the Genoese Christians and the Mongols had an altercation. And then later on, one of the Mongols was found dead. The Genoese retreated back to Caffa, and the Mongols followed, demanding that the culprits be turned over. When they weren't, it enraged the Mongol leader in this area, and they basically started an all-out siege on Caffa. This lasted for quite a long time. One source said that it lasted several months, from fall to spring of the next year. Another source said that the siege lasted for 3 years. Either one is a pretty substantial amount of time to be walled up in a city. Luckily, since it was directly attached to a port at their city walls, and one side of the city was open to the sea, they were able to have food brought in, so the situation was somewhat hopeful.
Like we'd said before, the defenses at Caffa were impenetrable, and the Mongols had been attacking Asian villages before they attacked Caffa, so now they were starting to get sick. Strangely sick. There was a disease running through their ranks and killing them by the thousands. A man named Gabriele de Mussi was not proven to be definitively present at the site of Caffa during this time, but he wrote substantially about it. Whether he was there or got his information from someone who was seems to be unknown, but his writings have been very helpful to researchers in trying to figure out what happened at the outpost. He wrote, quote, "In 1346, the countries of the East, countless numbers were struck down by a mysterious illness which brought sudden death. Within these countries, broad regions, far-spreading provinces, magnificent kingdoms, cities, towns, and settlements, ground down by illness and devoured by dreadful death, were soon stripped of their inhabitants. An eastern settlement under the rule of the Tartars called Tana, which lay to the north of Constantinople and was much frequented by Italian merchants, was totally abandoned after an incident there which led to its being besieged and attacked by hordes of Tartars who gathered in a short space of time."
So in that writing, de Mussi is referring to the earlier attack of the neighboring trading town called Tana. He goes on to write that several Christian people flee Tana because the Mongols were so strong that they knew that they couldn't beat them. These people fled to Caffa, and the Mongols followed them, laying siege on Caffa as well. This is when they noticed that the Mongols were being affected by a horrific disease. He goes on to describe this, quote, "It was as though arrows were raining down from heaven to strike and crush the Tartars' arrogance. All medical advice and attention was useless. The Tartars died as soon as the signs of the disease appeared on their bodies."
When de Mussi refers to the Tartars, he's talking about the particular Mongols in that area. From what I can understand, this was a time of religious discovery, and while most Mongols took the road to Buddhism, the Tartars were a group of Mongols that had chosen to follow Islam.
The Mongols, or Tartars, were sickened. Their morality was really poor, and their numbers were lessened. They figured out that there was no way that they were going to get through the walls of Caffa into the inner city, and they were so devastated by illness at the time that they really didn't care. But the leader was still mad. So in order to get his revenge, he decided to employ a new strategy for one last shot at the Genoese Christians: biological warfare. The Mongols took the plague-ridden bodies of the victims from their army, piled these people into trebuchets, and hurled them over the great wall that stood between them and the enemy. A trebuchet is like a big catapult, but it's able to hurl a lot more, right? It's for larger loads. Catapult for larger loads. Correct, Samantha?
It throws things.
It throws things, but bigger. Bigger things.
Big things.
Big things. So they were piling people into these things and just throwing them over, so it was raining the dead. They hoped that the incredible stench of the rotting and infected corpses would kill the people within the walls. They threw thousands of bodies over the walls, and the Christians inside had nowhere to go, while human bodies fell like rain from the skies into their midst, and they were basically standing in a box, so they couldn't really avoid the problem. They had to do something about it. They started dumping the deceased into the Black Sea, or they would just try to hurl them back out of the city walls, but not fast enough.
Everyone in the eastern part of the world had been affected. All races, all religions, all demographics, everyone. De Mussi goes on to write, quote, "The scale of the mortality and the form which it took persuaded those who lived weeping and lamenting through the bitter events of 1346 through 1348 that the last judgment had come." De Mussi was found to have been unlikely to have been at Caffa during this time, but his writings seem to have been deemed reliable by most historians because he would have had direct access to eyewitnesses who would have been present at the siege.
Eventually, the Genovese men decided to abandon their post. They had enough, and they hitched a ride out of the area with trading ships that had come by, and they just got out of Dodge. Unfortunately, the ships were home to millions and millions of other little creatures as well. Fleas. Not only fleas, though, also black rats. The fleas would feed like crazy on the infected humans and on the rats, infecting them as well. At each harbor stop, rats would leave the ships full of these people infected with the plague, and they would go on into the village to do their thing. Also, the city rats from the harbors would board the ships to see what they had on board to eat, and set sail with the ships full of infected people, creating even more infected rats to go out into the next port city. Italian writer Gabriele de Mussi wrote, quote, "Among those who had escaped from Caffa by boat were a few sailors who had been infected with the poisonous disease. Some boats were bound for Genoa. Others were bound for Venice and to other Christian areas. When the sailors reached these places and mixed with people there, it was as if they had brought evil spirits with them. Every city, every settlement, every place was poisoned by the contagious pestilence, and their inhabitants, both men and women, died suddenly. And when one person had contracted the illness, he poisoned his whole family, even as he fell and died, so that those preparing to bury his body were seized by death in the same way." End quote. And so begins the single largest catastrophe ever known to mankind, killing a higher proportion of the world population than any other known event. This week we present to you the spread of the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death.
We also want to take a few minutes to let you in on some recommendations that we have for some other shows. We know a few that may pique your interest. The Question Everything guys, Semperfi Rob, Sean, and the Mick host a show where they pick a different topic every week that usually seems to coincide with issues that we seem to be facing at the time as American people, and they discuss it. They usually do a Facebook Live every Saturday, and then they'll post the edited version to the podcast platforms a few days later. They also take call-ins from guests who have anything to say regarding the topic that week. So if you can relate in some way or have an opinion, get on their Facebook Live and give them a call and chat them up for a while.
MWP is another show that you guys should check out. Chach and Josh are funny and their conversations flow really well. They talk a lot about movies, wrestling, politics, whatever else comes up through the episode, with a lot of jokes and a lot of great personality. So check them out. You won't regret it.
The Kensington Corner with Tom and Jeff is another great show. They tackle the problems of the world one thing at a time, but they focus a lot on health and overall well-being, both mentally and physically, from a man's standpoint. And we found their show to be really interesting because they aren't afraid to really get into the everyday struggles that guys face, especially with mental health and stress. It's a really honest show, and one of them is a veteran, so they promote various causes associated with the mental health of veterans as well, which we think is incredible because it's a very important topic and our nation's veterans don't get the love and support that they deserve. Any conversation that can be had about how to improve that is fantastic. Miles away from Caffa before the ships had arrived, Europe was already dealing with its share of issues at the time. The amount of land that they had obviously had a direct impact on food production and how many people could be fed in an area. The amount of people living in Europe was far surpassing the amount of people that could be supported with the available food source. There were only so many jobs and the population was outgrowing that too. People were living in poor and impoverished conditions with no work or extra food available. Disease was a common thing. It was nothing that they weren't already used to. But the devastation that they had dealt with in the past and were dealing with right now was nothing like what was headed straight for them. And there was no way to get away from it. No escape.
People could possibly remain symptom-free from 1 to 7 days, but once they started developing symptoms like fever, chills, and vomiting, their odds weren't good. About 30 to 90% of the people who contracted the plague would end up perishing from it. After symptoms would start to develop and the person would begin feeling really sick, it was only a few days after that huge blackened boils would start to develop on certain parts of the body. These were called buboes. Don't laugh, Sam. And it was really just extreme swelling in lymph nodes. And I'm talking extreme swelling. It looked like clusters of black golf balls underneath their skin. Usually the swelling would start in the lymph nodes closest to where the person had been bitten by an infected flea or animal, and then move through the lymphatic system to other parts of the body. If you look at a photo of the lymphatic system in your body, you'll notice that you have big clusters of lymph nodes in your groin area, your armpits, and in your neck. That's typically where these big buboes would...
I got big buboes in my groin.
It's not funny.
It's really not.
It's just choice of words, I guess. This is where they would appear, and they were really, really painful. These buboes would grow so large. We're the worst. The worst. Anyway, they would either burst or seep blackened necrotic pus continuously. Sometimes the plague doctors would burst them intentionally in order to try to relieve some of the pain and pressure for the patient, but it's said that the black and smelly fluid that poured out of them was likely infectious and further spread the disease. Usually the appearance of the buboes was a good indication that the inflicted person would be deceased in under a week. I want to take this second to apologize for any background noise that you're hearing right now. Due to COVID-19, my house is full of people, and a lot of them are children, and although they're pretty quiet, you might hear kind of a banging here and there, and that's because they're upstairs and they're walking around. So we apologize for that. We'll try to cut out as many of those as possible. Also, on top of that, in the studio right now, we are housing a box full of baby ducks because it's too cold for them to go outside.
They're my therapy ducks.
Therapy ducks. So if you hear constant little chirps and peeping, which I'm not sure you will hear, but if you do, that's why.
Ignore it.
It's not Sam getting crazy.
Be thankful I don't have a chicken today. So, not long after this lovely and extremely unpleasant symptom began, the infected person's feet, hands, lips, and nose would start to actually die, and gangrene would set in on these parts of the body, which, as you can imagine, caused them an incredible amount of pain as well. Their deep flesh in these parts of the body was decomposing while they were still alive. The disease took many names during the time, such as the Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, and eventually, due to the blackening of the skin from necrosis and the blackening of the swollen lymphatic glands, it came to be affectionately known as the Black Death.
One of the Genoese ships carrying the infected Italian passengers from the village of Caffa rolled into Sicily in 1347. Expecting to find a ship full of goods, people rushed up to the dock to greet it. But when it landed, they boarded the ship to find pure horror. Most of the people who had been aboard the ship were dead when it arrived. The rest of the people on board were extremely ill with a disease that had never before been seen. It was obviously contagious, as it had done this much damage on one ship in just the amount of time that it had been at sail. Authorities were alerted, and they immediately ordered the ship to leave harbor. But sadly, it was too late. They didn't know that it was fleas carrying a bacteria called Yersinia pestis that would perpetuate the spread of the disease. Like we said before, the fleas would ride on the backs of rats, and each ship was completely infested with rats. This was a common thing. Rats had already run up the dock and into the town before anyone even really knew what was happening. And Sicily was a major hub of trading during this time. Once the city was infected, it was easy to perpetuate. Ships were going in and out of the harbor, docking and trading. Rats were running on and off the ships, and as the ships stopped at towns down the line, more of the infected rats would run into those towns as well, and so it went.
It was spreading like crazy along these trade routes, but in the mid-1300s, if you were a horrible disease, Constantinople was the place to be. It was the epicenter for just about everything, especially trade. It was the richest and most populated city on earth, and it was booming. The huge port sent out goods by boat to every port in the Mediterranean, so it didn't take long for the plague to reach Egypt, Italy, Russia, and India. People were going in and out of the city constantly, and trade movement wasn't strictly limited to water, obviously. They had to move things by land as well, so the plague got here by boat, but spread from there by both boat and land.
People lived in absolute fear. There was no way to avoid it and no one to help them. Especially the more impoverished and disenfranchised who couldn't simply flee to their second homes in the country like the more wealthy could. Other people who remained in the city had a different attitude. They would just live their best life because it was the end of days anyway. They drank, sang, and did literally whatever they wanted to pass the time, doing only things that pleased them and nothing more. Entire households had been wiped out and their homes sat empty, so people could just go in and out of them as though they were theirs, taking what they wanted and basically just living in them for a time. Divine law was pretty much not a thing anymore. Ministers had either opted to stay away, or a lot of them had died. So the good word that had kept everyone somewhat at bay before was no longer being spoken, and it became an every man for himself culture.
Most people cruelly decided to just avoid the sick and everything they touched. In a way, I can understand this because back then, they weren't sure how this was spreading, and it seemed like it took very little interaction with an inflicted person for someone else to end up in the same horrific condition. But on the other hand, it seems so cruel to leave them alone in their suffering. Many people were abandoned once they got sick, and they died in a lot of pain. Alone.
One plague-related quote that we found on Eyewitness to History website said this, quote, "One citizen avoided the other. Hardly any neighbor troubled about others. Relatives never or hardly ever visited each other. Moreover, such terror was struck into the hearts of men and women by this calamity, that brother abandoned brother, the uncle his nephew, the sister her brother, and very often the wife her husband. What is even worse, and nearly incredible, is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children, as if they had not been theirs.
In their defense, kids are dirty.
That's true. They are.
I'm kidding. Don't abandon your children. I feel like it's important to say that right now.
Yeah, we're not encouraging that behavior in any way.
I read a supposed ghost story while researching this topic that we thought was really sad. Because of the insane number of plague deaths and burials here, the British city of York is supposed to be one of the most haunted cities in Europe. A Ranker story tells of a family who moved into a house here and repeatedly heard long wails and crying throughout the halls. The crying was so sad that it depressed the couple so much and filled them with sympathy for the apparition. They did a little research of their home and found that during the plague, a little girl had lived there. Her parents both became sick with plague symptoms and had passed away. They were all she had. No one would go near her because they were too scared that she had been infected too, being with her parents all of this time. So, they resolved to lock her up in the house with her parents' corpses, boarding up all of the windows and doors, leaving her there to be forgotten. She remained healthy, but slowly starved to death.
Horrible. So see, there wasn't much sympathy for people. They were largely just ignored and avoided if they had any symptoms. Most doctors of the time backed off and became unwilling to try to help due to the high mortality rate and high risk of infection from a disease that they didn't even know anything about. It seems that a lot of them were of the belief that they couldn't help, so there was no sense in going in and becoming infected themselves. They didn't know what to do or how to treat it. All they could do was advise families, had they decided to remain in the home and help their loved one, on how to help lessen the symptoms and keep people as comfortable as they could while they watched their family members suffer. We know today that rats carrying infected fleas were the culprit for the spread of this horror, but they didn't. People then had no idea if it could be contracted through the air or even by touch. They didn't know how people were contracting it, and it seemed completely indiscriminate, affecting all ages, races, religions, etc.
There were some special cases, though. Medical practitioners who did stay in the trenches to help were called plague doctors. Every morning they would get up, dress covered from head to toe, pants tucked into thick black boots. They would put on a shirt and then cover that with a thick cloak, cover their entire face with a mask that had a long beak-like protrusion over the mouth and nose. In the beak part of the mask, they stuffed flowers and other pleasant-smelling things to avoid the strong stench of sickness and death within the household. Then they would top their heads with the typical brimmed doctor's cap. These brave physicians would go door to door, checking in and taking care of any ill folks within the home, giving advice to families and relieving symptoms as best they could.
Gabriele de Mussi wrote, quote, "Tell, O Sicily, and ye, the many islands of the sea, the judgments of God. Confess, O Genoa, what thou hast done, since we of Genoa and Venice are compelled to make God's chastisement manifest. Alas! Our ships enter the port, but of 1,000 sailors, hardly 10 are spared. We reach our homes, our kindred and our neighbors come from all parts to visit us. Woe to us, for we cast them the darts of death. Whilst we spoke to them, whilst they embraced us and kissed us, we scattered the poison from our lips. Going back to their homes, they in turn soon infected whole families, who in 3 days succumbed, and were buried in one common grave. Priests and doctors visiting the sick returned from their duties ill, and soon were numbered with the dead. O death, cruel, bitter, impious death, which thus breaks the bonds of affection of father and mother, brother, sister, son, and wife. Lamenting our misery, we feared to fly, yet we dared not remain."
You're listening to the Prescribed Films Podcast Network, home to hundreds of hours of free podcast entertainment. The shows on this network all have a common goal, providing you with the best discussions about movies and other forms of entertainment media. The PFPN hopes to fill your earholes with audio joy. Visit our website with links to all the other amazing shows at www.thepfpn.com. Thanks for listening.
There were theories floating around that this illness wasn't really a medical issue, but was a punishment from God for the sins of the people, and this theory proved to make a bad atmosphere even worse. Many Christians and Catholics turned their anger towards the Jews and Gypsies, blaming them for the reign of terror that God was supposedly putting them through. In many cases, they were tortured and killed by the thousands. Some Jewish people were tortured so badly that they ended up falsely confessing that they had poisoned wells in order to perpetuate the plague.
After these Jewish people made a confession like that, the people in Strasbourg, Germany decided to rid themselves of Jews for good. The Jews there were all arrested, and they were told that they could either repent for their sins and convert to Christianity, or be burned alive on stakes in rows with their fellow believers. Many of them converted, and they were baptized against their beliefs for fear of death for themselves and their families. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jewish people were killed this way. The council there canceled debts that the feudal lords owed them and took any money that the Jewish people had and rationed it out proportionately to the working men of the city. They then agreed that no Jewish people be allowed into the city for 100 years. They did readmit the Jews after 20 years, but I'm surprised any of them wanted to go back. Other cities in Europe had heard of this and decided, hey, that's a pretty good idea, doing the same thing to their Jewish population.
Not as much, but women were often blamed by society for the Black Death because it seemed that the majority of the inflicted or dead were men. So obviously, women were to blame for this because they were using witchcraft in order to take over and overthrow the patriarchy.
Sam just threw her fist in the air. Women were mostly charged to care for the dead and perform as nurses for the doctors. You would think that this would garner sympathy and admiration for doing such a tough job, but no. Granted, these were usually untrained individuals, and they were chosen from the very oldest, the dirtiest, and usually the most drunken parts of the population, as basically a sacrifice to the plague households. So, they weren't likely the most caring, and they weren't likely the most willing. These women were seen as completely revolting to the public, as they had been in contact with the infected quite often.
Don't be hating on your nurses, guys.
We talk about that. It was kind of like a big game of cooties. One physician, Nathaniel Hodges, even wrote calling them wretches and accused them of plundering the dead out of greediness and strangling their patients. Others accused the women of secretly conveying in the night and conspiring to take the fluid from open wounds of their patients in order to spread it on people who were well. Some people were assigned the job of searcher, and they walked the streets daily, visiting each home, taking note of the dead and the ill. They would then report their findings back to the city parish. If anyone in the home was found to be sick or dead, the family would be sealed inside of their home, and a red cross called the Plague Cross would be painted on their door to alert others of the infected house. Then, men called watchers would be assigned to the houses to be sure that no one went in or out, and that no goods or supplies came out of the home, only in. Corpse bearers would then go to each home and collect the bodies, burying them in mass graves.
Our girl, Florence Nightingale, would go on later in history to promote nursing as a more skilled and sophisticated profession that is to be performed with empathy and education. And being nurses ourselves, we love her for that.
Heck yes. The deaths from persecution and the plague were so widespread that the living had an extremely hard time keeping up with the amount of bodies that were piling up around them. They were literally stacking people up on top of one another outside of the town and city walls. A lot of the reason for that is because nobody wanted to deal with them for risk of exposure.
Did you see that post on Instagram where the chick was like, if I want to know if you were a bitch in high school, the only question I need to ask is, how's nursing going? Oh, like you're an asshole.
That's me.
In some areas, people were bleaching the bones of the dead and using them to construct houses and churches. One of the churches is actually still around. Sedlec Ossuary in the Czech Republic.
Mass burials were probably the most popular method for disposal. The cemeteries were full, and there wasn't enough consecrated ground to bury them individually, as was the usual method. Too many people were dying. Huge trenches were dug, and the dead were lined up along the bottom, covered with a little bit of dirt, and the next row of dead lined up on top of them, covered with a little bit of dirt, and they stacked them until the trench was packed full, and another trench would then be dug.
You know I love my fun facts.
And we have one for you now.
One area of Italy called Poveglia Island was said to have been used as a mass burial site for victims of the Black Death. Over this site, later in the 1920s, a mental hospital was built. The people within these walls were constantly talking about seeing ghostly apparitions with boils and infections covering their bodies. So one of the especially cruel physicians there decided to use the ghost sightings as a quick excuse to perform lobotomies on his patients in order to not have to deal with them anymore. It's said that the spirits of the plague victims began torturing the doctor, constantly harassing him until he finally went crazy enough to jump off of a building.
The people of Pavaglia still talk about ghostly sightings. Feelings of being watched, being scratched, or pushed due to hauntings from victims of the Black Death to this day. At one time, the island was open to tourism, but it has long since been closed. However, people still sneak onto the island to see if they can find anything scary there.
We also read that recently Italy wanted to try to rebuild the island in hopes of restoring it for residential and commercial use. They sent a construction crew over to rebuild an old hospital, maybe the old hospital we talked about earlier. I don't really know for sure, but that did not go well. I read that the construction crew promptly abandoned the site not long after starting work and did not feel compelled to explain why. They just left, and no one would say what happened to make them do this.
There are a million sad stories from this time period, no doubt, but one of the saddest that I read was of a monk named Gerardo Petrarca. I was drawn into this one because for all of you literature buffs out there, like myself, you'll be fascinated to know that Gerardo was the brother of Francesco Petrarca, otherwise known as Petrarch, who was a poet. And if you majored in literature in college, you probably read a thing or two by Petrarch, and you may remember it. So his brother, Gerardo, was a monk and serving in the Montreux Monastery, which was hit hard by the plague. Of all 35 brothers living there, he and his dog were the only two to have survived. Gerardo had to bury each and every one of his brothers, all 34 of them, alone.
Oh, that's kind of cool about how some people seem to have an immunity to it.
Yeah, I didn't mention this in our episode, but there were actually not huge, but big areas that weren't touched at all by the plague. And they were kind of right in the middle of Europe, so it's so weird that they wouldn't have been affected. But yeah, they talk about that a lot, that there does seem to be certain groups of people that seem to have been completely unaffected.
You say I didn't mention this in our episode, but literally we're mentioning it in the episode right now. Well, you didn't mention it in the writing, but it's in the episode.
I didn't mention it in the writing of the episode. Yeah, it is in the episode. You're totally right.
Here we are, in the episode. There were a lot of different treatments that were tried out during the plague as well, especially preventative, and they were interesting.
Rubbing onions or chopped up snakes on boils, drinking vinegar, arsenic or mercury, and we have already talked about the bursting of the buboes. Those were pretty common. Probably not helpful, but common. Physicians of the time also advised eating a diet that is balanced, but not like what we think of as a balanced diet today. There was a balance of hot, cold, wet, and dry. Eat something that fits into those categories daily, and this will help you keep from getting sick. But there were other methods of treatment that were even more bizarre by today's standards. Here we go.
Cutting up a pigeon or a chicken and rubbing it all over your body. It was called the Vicary method, named for the doctor who introduced it to society, Thomas Vicary. Quack, quack. If you were using a hen, you had to first shave her backside and then strap the buttocks of the live chicken to the affected area of the person, right on the boils or the swollen lymph nodes of the plague-ridden individual.
I just want to point out earlier that you said whack whack, and neither a pigeon nor a hen makes that noise.
No, but the quack doctor does.
Oh, gotcha. Ha. I see where you're going with that. Quack doctor.
Welcome to my world.
Right.
So then the chicken would get sick as well, at which point you would remove the chicken and wash it. After the chicken was clean, its shaped butt was put back on the swollen lymph nodes of the sick person. So you're walking around with a live chicken.
Well, you're not walking around. You're in bed.
When this extremely popular and widespread method didn't work, the chicken was released to spread the plague that they had now been exposed to all over the area. What a deal.
Well, they didn't know that it was fleas. So they just let the chicken go because it didn't work. And then it would just go spread more plague.
With a bare butt.
With its butt all exposed. Poor thing. No modesty for chickens during this time.
Did they shave the butt or did they pluck the butt? Because that would be horrific.
It seems like they would pluck it. It said shaved, but, it's feathers. So it seems more reasonable to pluck. Drinking a 10-year-old treacle. A treacle is a type of syrup that is made of several ingredients by herbalists. They would let the syrup sit around for about 10 years in order to grow molds and cultures, and then it would be available for drinking during sickness. This was popular medication during the time of the plague, and it sounds like it was very unsuccessful.
During the plague, another option was to go out and gather emeralds, crush them down into a pestle of basically glass shards, put them in water or food, and then down the hatch they went. We do not drink our rocks.
We don't drink rocks, especially pretty ones.
Right?
Bloodletting was another pretty popular option at the time. The idea of this was to reduce the amount of hot blood in a person's body when they are sick. This dates clear back to 800 BC and was used for a huge amount of illnesses. Bloodletting was commonly done using a relatively painless yet horribly disgusting technique. Yes, folks, I'm talking about leeches. Numerous leeches were collected by leech collectors in the medieval days and sold for a good amount of money. So this painless method was only affordable by the upper class. Multiple leeches could be placed on various parts of the infected person's body for a period of time. The lower class, however, endured a different method. Their skin was cut open at the vein and blood was drained into a bowl at their bedside. It was painful, and in those days, the conditions in which this was performed were far less than sanitary. So the risk of additional infection on top of what the patient was already experiencing was substantial.
So, if you thought the leeches were gross, you might wish for a cure like that after you hear about the next couple. Remember the incredibly inflamed lymph nodes that we talked about earlier? That were the size of golf balls underneath the skin a lot of the time? Well, with this next cure, those were cut open and drained. Common practice then, no big deal. Gross. But then, some very inventive individual thought to concoct a mix of plant roots, tree resin, and poop. Yes, I said poop, from a human. They mixed this up really good into a paste and applied this paste from hell directly to the open wounds. Yeah.
Not only that, but for some reason or another, it was advisable for the infected person to sit in a bath of human urine in order to relieve some of the plague's horrible symptoms. If you were not infected by the plague and you would be willing to collect your urine every day, you could make a good chunk of side cash for it because there were a lot of families willing to buy it for their loved ones in need. If simply sitting and soaking for a while in urine didn't seem to be effective in relieving you of your symptoms, you could always drink a few glasses of the clean urine a day in order to speed it along. I kind of feel like if they didn't have the plague before, they would after this.
Yeah, for sure. How much less painful would the wounds be when they're... Anyway, so gross. So people who believed that the Black Death came as a punishment from God began holding processions in the street in which they would publicly whip themselves for their sins and yelling out for others to do the same. They were hoping that this would compel God to take pity on them, stop the disease, and forgive them. They would also engage in self-chastising and would confess all of their sins to anyone who would listen, even if they were really minor sins. And people locked themselves away inside of the churches.
A small amount of people felt that the disease was related to recent large numbers of comet sightings in the night sky, and others thought that it was simply the devil invading the land for the coming apocalypse.
Throughout Europe, the plague was largely referred to as the Black Death, like we said before. It seemed that people needed to find a way to personify the thing that was killing so many of them in order to better understand and blame it. In Scandinavia, they identified the death as an old lady called the Pesta. It was told that she was a hideous and shriveled woman, and she would come by the houses of those who were infected. If she carried a rake with her, it was a hopeful sign that some people within the household would make it through and live. If she carried a broom, everyone inside was destined to perish.
Many people are aware of the immortalized, creepy, bird beak-like masks that were worn by the plague doctors. Well, they weren't only fashionable, but they did serve a functional purpose. Before doctors and scientists really understood that germs were what made people sick, there were a lot of other ideas floating around out there. Many, if not most, people believe that foul-smelling air is what carried the disease along. As infected bodies decompose, air begins to take on a certain odor, and the disease is spread. So if you can't smell it, it can infect you, right? Doctors would stuff flowers and other pleasant-smelling things down into the beak part of their masks in order to keep from contracting the disease that they were dealing with. Here we are in the 14th century dealing with a vicious pandemic, and the germ theory wasn't even a thing until the 19th century.
This theory about odors is called the miasmus theory. This theory was pretty much the dominating medical theory from the time of ancient Greece until the mid-19th century. They believed that disease entered the body through the presence of what they called miasmus in the air, and these could easily be identified by the strong-smelling foul odor. It has also been called the bad air theory. This wasn't only foul smell from death and disease, but from animal dung and human feces as well. Later on in the 14th century, it would become prohibited to dump dung or entrails in the waterways because this would promote bad air and cause sickness. Really, it was probably just poisoning their water, but I don't really know.
The reason for this theory is because the scholars and physicians had noted that cholera, malaria, and other disease was more present in areas where there was increased odor. It would be much later that they would figure out that disease was most present in these areas with bad odor due to unsanitary conditions causing increased germ activity rather than bad air.
Remember earlier we were talking about piles of dead bodies outside of city walls? The miasmus theory was why no one wanted any part of dealing with that. They started driving a cart through the streets and yelling, "Bring out your dead," every day so that the bodies could be taken immediately outside of the town daily to the mass graves for burial and the odor would not spread the disease.
It ran through the world for nearly 500 years before it finally stopped. But just in the 3 years after it started, between 1347 and 1350, it decimated 1/3 of England's population alone. By the time it was all over, it had killed about 60% of the population of Europe and Asia. It's speculated that years of exposure to death and decay had desensitized most of humanity during this time, and as a result, human life became much less valued. It was more expendable in people's eyes because they saw death every day. It didn't really affect them to witness death or gruesome treatments of others. Crime and war were far on the rise because of that. So not only were regular folks dealing with this terrifying sickness and trying to protect their families from it, they were dealing with rampant violence as well.
The plague changed the world. The social structure basically collapsed as it was, and it proved to be the end of serfdom and the feudal system as they had long known it. The people who were surviving the plague and were able to work and do manual labor weren't forced to do so, earning petty wages from the rich anymore. These people were needed. They were essential. Prices of goods and food were extremely high because due to the waning workforce, there wasn't enough of it. And even though there wasn't enough of it, no one was able to buy it because they couldn't afford it. They hadn't been working. They were able to negotiate and demand actual wages from the work that they were doing instead of basically being condemned to slave labor for scraps as they were before. They were in a position to demand land and opportunity because there was such a shortage of people left to do work, and due to a severely decreased population, there was less competition for land as well.
People no longer trusted and respected their leaders not only because they didn't protect them, but because they largely abandoned them. People turned away from the large churches, not completely, but they didn't rely on them as a need to get into heaven or to gain favor from God because they had seen the way that the church turned them away during their time of need. The church at the time was seen in a different light. People still attended church, but not because they were compelled to. Personal piety was flourishing, and people were finding their own path.
This didn't come without a fight, though. The aristocracy of the time didn't want to give up their lavish lifestyle and their slave labor. They fought the demands of the newly emerging revolutionary workforce, and this led to anger and riots all over, especially Europe. In the end, higher wages and a more independent workforce was established. However, the taxes that they had wanted to cut remained the same. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless, in a world that was moving in a better direction that would provide opportunity across the board, instead of hoarding it all at the top. The world was still fighting the plague here and there, but 3 or 4 years after it started, it had lessened significantly and things were starting to get back on track.
Women of the time even gained some rights here. They were at least permitted to keep the land of their husbands if they had perished during the plague. However, they were only allowed to do this for a certain period of time. They had to remarry, and then their husbands would receive the land. If they didn't remarry during this time frame, the land would go to the authority in the area or the male nobility.
Upon researching the Black Death, there was a lot of information found that I didn't remember learning in history classes when I was young. So we thought it'd be interesting to share with you guys since plagues and pandemics seem to be the ultimate topic of conversation these days. We also found it to be really interesting that a lot of scientists seem to be at odds about the type of plague that really invaded the world during the 14th century. Although this pandemic always seems to have been known to have been a bubonic plague, some credible people contend that this plague absolutely had to be airborne, making it a pneumonic plague. The reasoning behind their thinking is that they don't believe that rats could have perpetuated the spread so quickly. Others argue that the symptoms were recorded by witnesses at the time, and the fact that rat infestations were so rampant says that it could have been spread quickly due to fleas and rats. So, who knows? There are really smart people arguing it both ways.
Throughout the world, entire towns were wiped out. No survivors. These towns were often left deserted and to decay and they were never repopulated. They just sat empty until they became overgrown with trees and were taken back by Mother Nature herself. A lot of them weren't even discovered until aerial photography became a thing during World War I, and the planes flying overhead caught glimpses of the remains of buildings and structures deep in the trees. These towns were big finds, because it really helped in researching the toll that the Black Death took on individual cities and towns.
The plague is still a thing today. It's treated in modern times with antibiotics, but back in the 14th century, they didn't have that. So if you got it, you just had to ride it out and hope you were one of the luckier ones who would survive it. But your odds weren't good, and generally your family would try to take care of you in their home and watch you suffer and die a slow and agonizing death. This was happening in nearly every household. There was an outbreak as recently as the early 1990s in a remote area of India that really freaked out the world.
It appears that, according to popular belief, quarantine seems to have been the answer back then. And after all of the studying and crude treatments that they were attempting while trying to fight this pandemic, people eventually just resorted to staying away from each other. And this worked. Fun fact, the word quarantine actually comes from the time period of the Black Death. Ships were docking in Italian bays instead of harbors for 40 days before being permitted to dock, and they called this act quarenta.
40 days.
Mm-hmm.
So that's it for this week's episode of Bigfoot for Breakfast. We hope you learned something today. We know we did. Be sure to come back next week for more scary and interesting topics, because we have a crap ton of them lined up to share with you in the coming weeks, as long as you keep coming back to listen. We really appreciate the support that we receive from our listeners and try hard to respond to each message. We love the interaction, so keep it coming. If you get a few minutes and want to help support the show, we would really appreciate you taking the time to leave us a rating and a review on whichever podcast platform you listen from, because this helps us out a bunch and we really appreciate that as well. Another thing you can do to help us out is just tell a friend about us. Word of mouth is huge for our listener base, and just spreading the word to anyone who might be interested in listening is really awesome. Also, we have had some trouble lately getting shirts and cups from our last couple of contests, but we want to let you know that if you have these things coming, we did get them yesterday and we'll be shipping them to you now. So your free stuff is on the way, and we appreciate you being so patient. We do want to announce that since we're getting merchandise back in, we want to hold another contest. And all you have to do to enter is share our page on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and that's it. Your name is entered. Your name will be put in the mix for each time you share us on any of these platforms, so just go crazy. Do it.
With that, we'll be back next week, and we hope you will too.
Come at me, bro.